Oh,
So hi everybody, welcome. I'm glad you're here with us. My name is Steve Barnes. I'm the director of our Russian and Eurasian Studies program here at George Mason University. On behalf of our program, I'm just happy to continue to have these important conversations about the war in Ukraine. It's now almost 7 weeks since Russia started an unprovoked and criminal war against Ukraine. Each day, it seems, bring revelations of new horrors, from indiscriminate killings of civilians to sexual violence, the snatching of Ukrainian children and their forcible deportation to Russia, where they will reportedly be adopted by Russian families. And of course, the continued denial of the very right of existence for Ukraine and Ukrainians. President Biden, along with many scholars now of international law and genocide, have begun using precisely that word to talk about what is taking place. Our role at a research university is to be a hub for our community to continue discussing this war so that it is not forgotten, so that people don't become inured to the violence, so that people don't become tired of the stories. We're really honored this evening to have a couple of specialists from outside George Mason who have come to speak with us about their work and their research related to these events. Our moderator this evening is my colleague, Professor Matthew Mangold. Professor Mangold happened to be teaching a course this semester focused, among other things, on disinformation in Russian media, a topic that he knew was timely anyway, but that became even more urgent on February 24th. I'll turn things over to him with a thank you for contacting our speakers and setting up the event this evening. I'll also take a moment right now to call your attention to an event we have planned next Tuesday at 3 p.m. with Professor Vitaly Chernetsky from the University of Kansas, who will be talking about Ukrainian cinema and national identity. I'll put a link in the chat with information about that event for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Mangold.
thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Stephen Barnes, for organizing this wonderful response to Russia's war in Ukraine. We, in the REST program, Russian and Eurasian Studies, have had events almost every week for the last 7 weeks since Russia invaded. Which is an almost Herculean task that he's done very quickly and gracefully. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity for us to hear these speakers who are specialists on media and culture related to war, which Eastern Europe has seen very much of in the 20th and now 21st century. So I'll just quickly introduce our first speaker. Dr. Yuliya Ladygina is a professor of media and culture at Penn State University, focusing on the power of narrative to bridge cultural divides in individuals and in groups, and in response to war, and also its ability to widen them. She also focuses on finding the real facts as they are obscured by narratives, and analyzing thoroughly narratives of war themselves in all their truth and falsehoods. She highlights the capacity of memory to be multi-directional, meaning it's able to navigate multiple narratives, and the requirements that war forces us to revise entirely our pre-war beliefs, which is the state that many of us are in now. Her first book studies Ukrainian modernist views about the First World War, considering stories of war's unique cultural documents. Her talk today is Western Narratives of Russia's Hybrid War Against Ukraine, 2014 to 2022.
Well, thank you, Matthew, so much for your kind introduction. Let me share my screen and set up my presentation. Make sure that's, all right. Well, thank you once again for the introduction and for the invitation. It's really an honor to share my expertise and my personal reflections today with you and our audience. Let me start my presentation with one brief personal fact that really shaped what I'm about to present today. I was born and raised in a small village north of Ukraine, which happened to be located from 7 to 50 miles away from the cluster of towns that have been recently featured in all Western news: Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Dimerka, Borodyanka, So those are towns very close to home where I grew up with many friends who were caught in the nightmares, but luckily everyone survived, people close to me. So for that reason, it's been really painful to watch how overly cautious the West has been in its representation of Russia's violations of international law and its disregard for human lives. It's been equally heartbreaking to realize how little the world understands about the nature of the ongoing war, its geopolitical significance, its long-term consequences, which will certainly destabilize American lives for generations to come. Therefore, instead of sharing my current research on the recent representations of war in Ukrainian films post-2014, something that I'm sure Vitaly Chernetsky will share with you and report on next Wednesday, I've decided to talk about some of the major misperceptions and misrepresentations of Russia's war against Ukraine in Western academic and analytical texts. Prior to the latest invasion, full-scale invasion that started over 6 weeks ago. To do so, I'll combine my own observations with those of my colleagues and Tim Snyder, Sergei Yakelchik, Peter Pomerantsev, Volodymyr Kulik, and Mykola Rabchuk are the key names I want to mention here. But first, let me offer a few points about historical and cultural context that will help set up the stage for my presentation. And I'll start with a very basic question. What is Ukraine and what is it that the West does not get about it? Well, first of all, Ukraine, when we talk about any country, we talk about geography, we talk about people, we talk about history. And Ukraine is quite a country. It's the largest country in Europe. And its population at 41 million constitutes quite a substantial number of people. Just to give you the perspective, I have another interesting map of the territory of Ukraine superimposed on the American map, and it gives you a pretty good perspective. Another map to bring things closer to Europe and to highlight my next point about the history of Ukraine is also shows the dimensions of that country superimposed on the map of Europe. So one of the key moments from Ukrainian history to keep in mind, pardon? Oh, I'm sorry, there was some mishappenings with the microphone, I believe so. So one of the key things to keep in mind about Ukraine's history is that it is a normal European country, and what happens in Ukraine shapes European affairs, be they economic, political, cultural, sociological, social, or environmental. And this is something that has been going for quite some time. This is something that some of the lead historians have been discussing and elaborated on very extensively. Again, Tim Snyder, Serhiy Plokhy would be the references here. Next point that I want to bring up, and I understand that this informational poster might be harder to read, but to keep in mind some of the key developments in post-Soviet Ukraine. And I'll start with the basic question: what happens after empires fall? This is very important to think about when we talk about post-Soviet states. Well, normally there are two scenarios. Those remnants of the empires either look for ways to unite and to find a way to integrate, as it happened with European Union. Many European states at the end of 20th century came together, or there is a different scenario to to find an attempt to restore the empire. And it seems to be what Putin's Russia is afterwards, with its neo-imperial agenda crystallizing the idea of Ruski Mir. Well, when Ukraine emerged from the Soviet experience, it made it very clear in 1991, right here, that the majority of people wanted to go a separate way from the Soviet Union, but foremost from Russia. In 1994, I'll highlight a few dates here, The Ukrainian government asserted its pro-European and pro-NATO course by signing a few important documents. Number one was the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement with European Union, and number two, the Budapest Memorandum, according to which Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in exchange of security guarantees, but also with hopes to establish good karma with Western powers, and in hopes of eventually to maybe even join NATO, something that Ukraine expressed in 2008, but was rejected at that point. Another important set of dates is 2004 and 2013-2014. So those are the years of two recent revolutions, very important revolutions, during which Ukraine and Ukrainian people made it very clear that they want to part ways with Russia. These were the two revolutions, Orange and Euromaidan revolutions, during which Ukraine experienced a self-organized mass mobilization and decentralized protest, which in turn triggered a profound revision of what it means to be Ukrainian. And from that experience, Ukraine as a nation emerged united not by ethnic or linguistic markers, but by civil commitments and dedication to democratic values. Basically, Ukraine emerged at that point as a democracy, flawed on many levels, but driven by the belief in free choice and united by shared views as to the future of Ukraine. And that was in direct opposition to what was going on, or what is still going on, in Putin's Russia, which came to be an autocratic regime driven and designed and controlled by the vertical of power, and also by overwhelming fear of the regime. The tensions between two models eventually bursted into full-blown war. And here I want to point out just a few moments about the nature of that war, something that is also unprecedented, a little understood in the broader global context, but is essential in realizing and grasping of what's going on in the region and what are its significance. And that's the nature of this war, the hybrid nature of the ongoing war, which went through several stages. But let's start with a brief definition. What is this type of war? It's a simultaneous and adaptive use of conventional warfare, but also terrorism, criminal behavior, and irregular warfare. And this is the key concept right here. When we talk about irregular warfare, we talk about cyber attacks, we talk about weaponization of information, which is crucial to what I am going to talk in the remainder of this presentation, and of course, interference in political, economic, and cultural domains. Those are very important levels and tools that could be used in different proportion with different intensity and in a variety of combination. If we look at what happened in Ukraine with the ongoing war, we can break it into several phases. Phase number one started with the Euromaidan and Russia's pressure on Ukraine, on the pro-Russian government at the time, government of Yanukovych, to back out of its commitment to sign the agreement, the trade agreement with the European Union. Russia employed political measures and economic measures, used Ukraine's vulnerabilities and its dependency on Russian gas and debt to Russia to achieve its objective, its political objective. But that wasn't taken lightly by the masses, by the people, and the Euromaidan quickly grew into large-scale mass movement that resulted in ousting the corrupt president, pro-Russian president. That set into motion phase two, where now it's not only political pressure and economic pressure that Russia used, but Russia used also military presence and informational warfare. Again, capitalizing on a number of vulnerabilities that allowed it to take over Crimea, secure control over Crimea in March of 2014, and also set in motion the bloody conflict in Russia, in Donbas, and eventually transform it into frozen conflict that gives Russia a lot of leverage in the region and limits Ukraine's possibility moving towards Ukraine, towards the European Union and all kinds of associations in that part of the world. So what's important here at this point is to look at the Western response in 2014. Yes, sanctions were put in place, but they were minimal. And even though they brought some results within a few years, and Russia did suffer several economic setbacks, they were eventually wrapped up and adapted those setbacks into Kremlin's propaganda machine, framing West, evil West, that simply puts pressure and only allowed Putin to boost his standing and his support in domestically. So another important responses were financial aid to Ukraine, the sales of weapons and eventually lethal weapons later in the process, and military training. Although those measures did not help in restoring Ukraine's control over its territory, they set in motion processes that really caught the whole world by surprise with the degree and amount of resistance and courage and ability and skill that Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian people demonstrated 6 weeks ago. And that's where we get into the third phase of the ongoing war. And here we can talk about a set of miscalculations on part of Russia. First of all, a misunderstanding and miscalculating how strong the leadership and how committed Ukraine's leadership was and still is. Perhaps those narratives that framed Zelensky as nothing more but a clown, that are still very popular in Western media and overlook a decades-long commitment to social change, to political satire, to an involvement in civil society of Ukraine. Number two is an underestimation of the social unity within Ukraine, something that took place during Euromaidan revolution, as I mentioned, that transformation, and also as a result of Russia's aggression in the east and annexation of Crimea, something that triggered a profound reevaluation of what it means to be Ukrainian, where Ukrainians chose to unite behind their shared views as to their future, not necessarily behind any ethnic or linguistic markers. That's really by now is in the past in Ukraine. And of course, military, the miscalculation of how grand and massive and apt a Russian military is and how modernized a Ukrainian military has become over the recent years. And the last point is Western support. Again, I think the West is also very much surprised, some regions in the West, of how mobilized some of the key players in international global affairs have become over the past couple of weeks. But these miscalculations also, we can tie them to a mixture of messages, quite often different messages that were circulated in Ukraine, in Russia, but also in the West. So our miscalculations and misunderstanding, misperception of happened, which translated in that amazement and surprise and fascination with the resistance and defiance and bravery that Ukrainians were able to correspond. That could be tied to the narratives that were popularized in Western academia and among Western analysts, and were produced as a response to the events in Ukraine in 2013 and onward, by intellectuals and by analysts who had hardly followed the events in Ukraine or around Ukraine before that, but jump in on the topic and responded with an outpouring of publications, often limiting their attention to influential states and global processes, and as a result, generating those mixed messages about Russia's aggression against Ukraine. In what follows, I'll discuss 6 key narratives that were circulated and before the February of 2022 and were decisive in shaping public opinion, but also policy. So notably, all of these narratives share some elements, but in their extreme versions, they are mutually exclusive, either in their presentation of what happened or who is responsible and who should be held responsible, or in their proposed ways on how to handle and resolve the conflict. Such divergences could be partially explained by the complex nature of the conflict, by academic differences in perspectives on international relations, or by long-standing regional economic interests and political alliances. So the first narrative that is called crime and punishment. I will go through all these narratives, talking about key moments, talking about responsibilities, solutions that are proposed by those narratives, and some of the definitions used to characterize the ongoing war in Ukraine. And again, these narratives are based on the scholarly articles, on the surveys of scholarly articles, but also on key publications in political journals and periodicals and newspapers that from the United States, the United Kingdom, and a number of countries across Europe. So with the first narrative, this narrative is essentially about Russia's unprovoked aggression, reflected in a sequence of events, including its seizure of Crimea, instigation of separatist movements in the southeast of Ukraine, involvement in the Donbas war, and the latest full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It frames the conflict as international and holds Russia fully responsible for the aggression and its violation of international law. Accordingly, the advocates of this narrative call for deference and urge the West to intensify its effort to counter the aggression, imposing tougher sanctions, right, providing more aid to Ukraine in short term, but also supporting its democracy and pro-European integration in the long term. This narrative is characterized by strong and negatively charged names: hybrid war, Russian-Ukrainian war, Russian aggression, Russian occupation, Russian invasion. And its dominant voices are present in Poland, the Baltics, the United Kingdom, and the US. This narrative also has a vocal minority in Germany, in France. The next narrative is called the taming of the shrew. And this narrative tries to reconcile the recognition of Russia's aggression and its military strategic threat to the West with the strategic aim of conducting dialogue and searching for compromises with that state. Thus, although Russia is framed as an aggressor, the main imperative is to keep the door open for the dialogue. And the reasoning goes along the lines that the danger Russia creates is at best of secondary importance, because, and again, it's prior to the latest invasion, the research based on the analysis of texts that came before February 2022. This concept of this position is rooted in the beliefs that Russia doesn't want to go too far or only wants to send a message, that Russia doesn't have either means or resources for a major non-nuclear war in the West, that its aggression against Ukraine and some other post-Soviet states can be explained by a unique fusion of historical, cultural, and geopolitical factors, and that its aggression is likely to be contained in the region. Accordingly, this narrative argues that security threats in Eastern Europe can be contained for the sake of cooperation with Russia in the Near East, or on solving global challenges such as climate change. In a nutshell, this is the narrative of appeasement of a not very dangerous aggressor for a greater common good. And until recently, Ukraine has been viewed in this context as so vulnerable and weak that there was no way anyone could help it against Russia. So this is the solution: is search for seek dialogue with Russia and find a way to force Ukraine into some significant concessions. The naming, the language and the naming of the conflict right away is much more ambiguous and vague. It's defined as crisis, where it's harder to establish the responsibility. And this is the narrative that has quite a few dominant voices in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the US, and also a vocal minority in Italy. The next narrative, number 3, titled Band Sinister, this narrative with this narrative, the ongoing war is presented as an internally driven conflict, and the Ukrainian government is framed as mostly responsible for it. It revolves around the alleged irreconcilable identity differences between Kiev and pro-European Western Ukraine on the one hand, and Ukraine's pro-Russian southeastern regions on the other hand. This is the narrative where an exaggerated attention is paid to Ukraine's far right. And as a result, all those discussions about Nazis, junta, right, and eventual denazification of Ukraine. With this narrative, Ukraine's responsibility is often combined with complicity of the West, which provided support for the Ukrainian government. In contrast, Russia's participation is downplayed, and its role is reduced to that of a catalyst. Accordingly, the resolution of this conflict calls here for a quick and full normalization of relations with Russia, the halting of all pro-Western movements on the part of Ukraine, and a revision of Ukraine's internal politics, which means, again, major concessions on Ukraine's part. Again, this narrative is characterized by ambiguous and misleading language, and it's dominant in Greece and Italy and some other Slavic pro-European countries, there is also a vocal minority that shares the same position in France and the United States. The next narrative I want to talk about is the ballad of the East and the West. And again, with this narrative, the ongoing war. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I've skipped something. Did I? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Oh, all right. So this one, right? So I think I've skipped in my discussion something. Okay, so I've discussed this, and not this one. I actually talked about. I'm sorry, I got lost in my presentation. So this is the East and West. Again, they're very similar. The third and the fourth are very similar. It's the fourth, this ballad of the East and West confrontation, is even more radical and pays even more emphasis on on the radical parties in Ukraine and frames the conflict exclusively as a civil war, undermining and diminishing Russia's involvement. And this is the narrative that is dominant in Greece, but also there is a conversation about it in Italy. So next narrative, and that's also very important for us in our context, is the so-called narrative of bloody Meridian. And in this case, this narrative promotes the combined symmetrical responsibilities of the West and Russia for the situation in Ukraine and the entire region. And notably, it omits Ukraine as a political actor, framing it as an object of geopolitical rivalry between the West and Russia over the influence in Eastern Europe. Similarly to some of the previous narratives, Band Sinister or the Ballad of East and West, Russian deeds are presented here as a reaction to the alleged Western provocations. Hence, the resolution here is a dialogue on the new security architecture with no regards to Ukraine's interest. And again, the conflict, the war is characterized as conflict with the very ambiguous connotations in language. And these are popular narratives in Greece and Italy, but also very prominent. There is a very vocal minority in United Kingdom, United States, France, and Germany. This takes us to the final narrative, Count Zero, and this narrative treats the conflict as a given without pondering on the questions of responsibility or possible solutions. It implies equal responsibility on all sides and concentrates on some narrow questions related to the ongoing war, such as human rights, environmental problems, or economic hardship, and hence promotes a dialogue as a way to resolve those conflicts, not necessarily acknowledging or trying to find a way from the bigger question, the violence and the war. This, again, the language, again, we're sticking to the same crisis, Ukraine crisis framing. And while there are no dominant regions with such attitudes, there are loud enough voices across many countries in the United States, in the West, I'm sorry. And I would like to wrap up with just a reminder that proper definitions, proper naming does matter, because these definitions not only shape public awareness of the war and its global implications, but they also influence policy and regional and international response to Russia's threats to global peace and economic stability. So once again, Russia's war in Ukraine at this point is so far away from just a regional conflict. It's a true global war, and its ramifications will be felt for a long time. That is why the sooner West responds firmly, the more chances we have at this point to secure the future of democracy and smooth globalization. So thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to follow up with more questions. And again, I apologize for mixing up my presentations with my points.
No worries at all. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Just absolutely packed with information and ways to think about this and ways not to think about it. Great. Yeah, and we'll switch into the second presentation, and then we'll take questions on both afterwards, if that's okay with everybody. All right, so our second speaker, Dr. Natalia Savelyeva, is a resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. She's a sociologist who studies the experience of war and its effects on soldiers, fighters, and populations in which violent events transpire. She's worked on the Donbas region, which is the region in eastern Ukraine that's separated from Ukraine in 2014 illegally, sparking the war between Russia, pro-Russian and Russian-backed separatists against the Ukrainian military. That is part of the historical background of the current war in Ukraine today. She's focused on the Kremlin narrative of the war in Ukraine and the lies, deception, and manipulation on which it has founded its narrative. She also focuses on protests in Russia, most recently spearheading sociological studies of what Russians think of the war in Ukraine. And the title of her presentation, which I think we should think of in the context of disinformation that, that the Russian state is disseminating to its population, is What War? I think you're muted.
I am muted. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sharing my screen. I hope you will be able to see my presentation.
At the bottom, I think it says enter full screen. Okay.
Yeah, you see it right. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I came to DC to continue studying Donbas war. As Matthew said, I was studying pro-Russian side of the conflict, right? But then this horrible conflict has started, and me and my colleagues from Public Sociology Laboratory, this is a self-organized research initiative, and we, for the last 10 years, we've been working mostly on post-Soviet region, on Russia and Ukraine, on protest movements there. So we decided to launch a project. It was pretty spontaneously to understand what people in Russia thinks about war, right? So I think that almost all of you at least seen those numbers which are coming from public opinion polls, and which says, and I mean, that's also like an official point of view in Russia, that Russians support the war. So, and the poll says at the beginning there was something like the modest numbers were around 60-something% of support, and now it's the last poll, it showed 73% of support of the war, 78% of support for Putin, and also the fact that like 90% of people believe that there is an information war against Russia is going on right now. Right, so all those numbers are there, but I want to make a couple of remarks before I move to my main part, about which is dedicated to unpacking the views of Russia about war. So the first thing is like, is that many people support war in Russia? Well, I don't think so. So not really, because first there are problems with opinion polls in autocracies, because there are a lot of problems that are well discussed in the literature. People are afraid of responding, of giving the fair responses. They sometimes the questions are not really, sometimes questions mix the support for the president and for authorities and support of the particular politics. And so on. There was also recent studies, a couple of them, which was pretty interesting, and they demonstrated that actually those numbers of support, they're probably at least 10% less, because one was the list experiment, and it demonstrated that if you don't ask people directly about their support about the war, you get 10%, 50% of less of support. Right, and the other one was recently published. That was about endogenous popularity, but it was about Putin. But I guess we can use this argument about war the same. So the idea is that people support Putin because they know that other people support Putin, because polls tell them that people support Putin. So I guess we can see something like that if we will make research about that, about war. We will see something like that. People just believe that everybody, like the majority of Russians, supports the war, and it makes them also like to be more inclined, make them at least saying, or at least demonstrating that when they're talking to public opinion or to pollsters that they support the war. So I would say that the numbers of support is less that we see in polls and that we see in polls, but those numbers are still significant. And what I want to talk about today is just to dig into that support and to understand how this public opinion in Russia is structured and what it actually means to support the war or not to support the war, and what actually we have in people's heads now. So I will say a couple of words about our research. We started doing that on February 27th, so during the first week of the war, and we are still continuing to collect data. And for now, we collected more than 130 interviews, pretty long ones. So usually it's something about 1 hour with people who have different opinions about war. So from open supporters, very vocal, to open protesters, and like everything in between. Those are people with different social background, who has different income, education, they're from different cities, but still our sample is not representative. I mean, we cannot reach any representative sample right now. And we're using snowballing to reach the people with whom we talk that provide much more trust. And that's also like our goal, because we want people to talk with us more or less honestly. And we rely a lot on the help. So it's not only public sociology laboratory people who conduct that, but that's really like a sort of collective research with many people involved. Many people collect data, many people make coding for the data. So that's also I mean, very encouraging project from the point of view of how it is organized. So, and what we see now, I just will talk about some preliminary results, because we're still working on this data. So what we see, if we talk about what people think about the war, we see a sort of continuum. So we see a body of war. That's not all the supporters, but that's like the more extremist supporters. Those are the people who say like, yes, the war is good, we support the war, Ukraine is just not a state, we should defeat Ukraine, we should defeat the West, let's just take over Kyiv, something like that. And if you were following how the first news about results of peace talks were, and there's the news that Russia take some of its troops from Kyiv Oblast, and after that we saw all that happened in Bucha. So people commented on news sites and in YouTube. They were just, oh my God, you are traitors, why you are doing that, why we started this war, just go on, why you take out our troops, Russian troops, no, you have to go, you have to push. So this is the party of war. They're pretty happy with everything what's going on, right? But I guess that it's not the majority of people in Russia, and I also don't think that this is the majority of people who support the war. And there are other type of supporters. They are much more moderate, and they have much more doubt. So they're saying basically, so yes, I support the war, but then they say a lot of then they use some counter arguments. So I don't like that people are dying. I don't understand why we're doing that. I don't understand what will be a result. I'm afraid of what's going on, and so on and so on and so on. They also use a lot of justifications for their opinion, like that was inevitable. Then we have the group of people, and as I said, that's a continuum. We don't have those strict group 1, group 2, group 3. They're just sort of, it's a continuum. When I have those, I don't know, people. So those are the people that can be more close. They can be closer to the supporters. They can be closer to the opponents. But they basically say, well, I don't have any opinion. I just don't understand what's going on. From one point of view, we see that. From the other hand, we see that. It's very difficult to understand. I don't want to have any opinion, and I try to distance myself from what's going on. Then we'll have a group of people who are more on the side of the opposition of the war, and then we see this, what I call the party of peace. Those are protesters, but also non-protesters, but those are the people who are against the war, and they don't protest now because now it's become, with all the people with whom I talk, they say yeah, that's just dangerous. I cannot, I have children, I have parents, I have my obligations, I cannot go out of the street to be arrested and just disappear in like to be jailed. So we have those two parties and like sort of continuum in between them. What is the difference between those like two poles? They're really different. So if we're talking about party of peace, that can be people with very different background. That can be people who participated in protests before 2022. Some of them never was even interested in politics and never followed any political news. So their background is pretty different. The first thing, which is pretty common for all of them, is that we have a question about how they get known about the war and what was their first emotions. And what they say about first emotions, they said that they was shocked, they was just horrified, they were depressed, they felt anxiety, hopelessness, and that lasts for some time. So their emotions were just horrible. For them, it was like the end of the world. They were not able to work, whatever. In their interviews, we don't see justifications, any justification like for the war and for killing people. So they don't say, oh yes, we had to kill those, we had to start the war because NATO encircled Russia. No, they don't say it. They just, no, we cannot justify that. Putin went mad and I don't understand like why this is happening. It just cannot be. It shouldn't happen. They also, the most of them, they're pretty serious about, they worry very much about sanctions, and a lot of them, they believe that sanctions will destroy Russia. And like the last 30 years, they will be just for nothing. And they also believe that the Ukraine is a separate state and like there is no Nazism there. I mean, there can be some nationalists there, but there is no Nazism there. Like NATO does not threaten Russia, but even there is any threat, that's not enough to start a war with Ukraine and so on. So this is this like pole, the party of peace. The party of war is pretty different. Those first thing is that their emotions were pretty different. The emotions were, so some of them was upset or shocked, but many of them was a sort of release. They said like, yes, I was expecting that. And I was like, yeah, finally it started. Okay, so now all that tensions, now we will come to some resolution. They just had no emotions. I mean, that it just said, yeah, yes, I expected that. So I was not surprised. They believe that the West is so they have this sort of geopolitical imagination, and they see this bigger picture when the West is the main enemy of Russia. And this war actually is about Russia and the West, because Russia has to defend itself and the West want to destroy Russia and so on and so on. They also say that we're saving Donbas, that's very important, and there are like Nazis in Ukraine. So you can see all those cliches from I don't know, Russian official media there. But actually that's not just a cliche, right? That was like, it's not a period right now. And I will say a couple of words about that later. So some of them also believe that sanctions will hit Russia a lot, but comparing to this party of peace, a lot of them are much more relaxed about sanctions. They're like, yeah, sanctions, well, that will be bad, but then it will be okay. Yeah, that will be bad, but maybe, I mean, we will develop our own production or whatever. Or like, yeah, that will be, I mean, yeah, they're much more like relaxed about that. I mean, some of them believe that that will be good, that will be bad, but not as many people as in this party of peace. And this is a sort of, I would say, typical example of what those people can say, like the party of war, the most radical Russians who support that. So this is a man, and he says, so you can see here like all the aggressive stuff, like Ukraine is not a state, so there was all other possibilities were exhausted. So that basically means that Russia had to start this war, and Ukraine had already started a military operation attacking Donbas. And Ukraine is not actually a quasi-state. Ukraine is just a terrorist. It's like ISIS or Taliban. It's very aggressive. It's just destroy everything, and some crazy people ruling Ukraine. So, and Ukraine is very harmful harmful organization. So, and actually what is going on is good for Ukraine. I mean, because that's good. I mean, because Ukraine will be, I mean, those nationalistic groups in Ukraine, radical nationalists, they will be destroyed. So that will be good for Ukraine. And in general, this special operation is good because that will bring peace to Europe. So I would say that the party of war, it thinks about what's going on in this like very strange and perverse frame, like war is peace, something like that. Yeah. The other thing which we can see, and this characteristic reminds me very much those people who supported pro-Russian side at 2014 in Ukraine. So we see two very strong sentiments behind all those justifications for the war and behind all those reasons people use to explain why this war was necessary and why they support it. So those two feelings are resentment and fear. And they're very much, those two feelings, they're very much connected because they come from, I mean, just because the source for both of those feelings is the West. Some sort of like US is the main part of the West, but some sort of imagined generalized West, the West who wants to destroy Russia, the West who never wanted Russia to succeed, to be a developed country, to have a strong economy, whatever. But at the same time, the West itself, it's not, it's seen through this lenses of what is Vyacheslav Morozov called subaltern empire. So Russia and people who use this framing, they use this logic of subaltern empire. So they basically love the West, right? Like you can see in this quotation, I think that's very remarkable because the guy is saying that like he blames the West for this war and for like all the wars which happen anytime, anywhere in the world. And he says, but I love US because I love iPhones, I love American culture, I love McDonald's, I love all that. But we should know that like this is, US is an instigator. So US stays behind any war and US wants to destroy us. And this is what US is doing right now. It is just destroying us economically. And the whole world turned against us. So this is what is happening. And to be able to have something like that in your head, it is not just there is Russia, a big player, and the West, a big player, and there is a competition between them, right? That's not like that. Here we see this idea that Russia is empire, but Russia has its subaltern. Russia is really a subaltern empire because the West is like bigger, and Russia is sort of subaltern of the West. And a lot of frustration comes from that understanding. And if we think about the coverage, news coverage in Russia, and how propaganda is organized and how very much all official talks, how they frame all this conflict, that's very much about like the West, the West, the West, the West. The West want to destroy us. The West want this, the West want that. And the idea of subaltern empire is that Russia is defined through this primarily through this relationship to the West. And what is important here that those, as I said, resentment and fear, they were the most important emotions, mobilizing emotions during the Donbas conflict. So if we look at the narratives of those people who joined non-state armed groups, pro-Russian armed groups in 2014, that doesn't matter if that was local people or if that was people who traveled from Russia. We can see that we just see the same thing. So people are frightened by the West or by Western Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationalists, and people feel this resentment that the West like the generalized West or the Western Ukraine want to take over Donbas or want to take over Russia. And I think that, I mean, I think that's like an interesting coincidence, if it is a coincidence. So, if we are moving, if we are like to come back to this idea of two poles, what is interesting here that we see, I mean, just forget a little bit about the body of war. Let's talk about those people who support the war and like those people who more or less support the war or they don't know what they support. So here we can see different forms of justification and denial. And and those forms of justification, basically justification is transforming into denial if we move from more support to like more doubt. So how people justify the war? So the most, I guess, common thing is just that this war was unavoidable and Russia had no choice and that war would start anyway. Russia just started it first. So that's a sort of make Russia not responsible for what's going on because that just doesn't matter. Russia started this war, somebody else will start the war. So Russia is not an aggressor, basically what it means. The second argument here is that this is not a real war. So there are real wars. For example, the war in Iraq, when US was destroying civil objects and civil populations and a lot of civilians were killed, but it's not like that. Because Russia not aiming at killing civilians. The other argument, it's sort of like weaker argument, is like other countries do that too, but nobody punished them. But everybody now is against Russia. But why is that so? Because if everybody does that, what's the problem here with Russia? So you see that we are coming from more justification to more like forms of denial, because other countries do that. That's not a very strong argument, but it's like, yeah, everybody does that, so that's not a problem. That's more like that's on the like something in between justification and denial. So another thing that people say pretty often is that, and this is more about people who are not supporters and who are not the opponents of the war, who have a lot of doubts and who often say like, well, I just don't understand what's going on. They say, well, I really just don't understand what was the reason for that war, why we started this war, but probably there must be some reasons for the war, right? Because Russia started the war, so there must be some, so maybe Putin knows why we do that, because Putin has much more information than we ordinary people have. So there must be something there. There should be some rational reasons. There should be some justifications for this war. We just don't know that. I just don't know that. The other form of denial is like, we should stand with our country. So our country is fighting. So I don't know if this war is good or bad, or if it is war at all, but we should just be here and we should not protest the war. Whatever we think about that, we just should stay with our country. We should be united. The other form of denial is like this: we don't know all the truth. We don't know all the truth, and this is why, and we'll never know the truth, and politics is very, very complicated, so I cannot have my own opinion about what's going on, so I will stay, I try to keep a distance, and yeah. And here also all those like narratives about like everybody lies and propaganda is everywhere. You cannot trust any media. So yeah, maybe those people who were killed in Bucha, they were not really killed, or maybe they were killed, but still I cannot judge about that because propaganda is everywhere. And the last form of denial is like, we cannot do anything, right? Like whatever. Maybe this war is wrong, but we cannot do anything, like, or well, maybe it's all wrong, but this war is already happening, so whatever. And if we cannot do anything, so why I should have my own opinion about that? And the important thing I think here is to understand, so, and because of all those narratives, there was a lot of arguments about Russian slave mentality, or because Russians just have no morals, and so on and so on. But I don't think that that's about a slave mentality, or that's about like morals. I think that this is much more about depoliticization, which is part of authoritarian regime, that it's like a necessary part of the authoritarian regime, because people, they just don't, they know that their opinion means nothing. They know that they cannot influence anyhow to what's going on in politics. And they kind of feel that, like, whatever, why should I have? They actually don't need to have an opinion. The state wants to keep them distanced. The state wants to keep them out of politics. And this is like this idea that, oh, they are whatever, I don't have my own opinion, that can be just a result of this like whole situation of depoliticization within a political culture as a part of authoritarian regime. And if you see, if you look at those quotations, I mean, we see it here. That's very, for me, it's very, very twisted. Like, for example, the first quotation, it belongs to a woman like my age, who is very well off, who lives in Moscow. And she says, like, I'm not interested in politics because I just believe we know only 5% of what is happening. And we see it one step forward, and Putin and Zelensky see it 30 steps forward, and all those discussions. So to talk about it, to upset with it, to look at all those videos and photos, like, why would I do that? I just don't want to spend my energy on it because there is nothing I can do, and I just cannot even understand if it's true or not, and probably 90% of all that is just a fake. So why would I spend my energy on that? But then she says that if I have an opportunity to influence the situation, if something depends on me, sure, I will do anything to stop the war. But that's a sort of, I mean, that's a sort of a trap, like, right? I mean, you cannot, I mean, that's a trap because there is never an opportunity in authoritarian regimes to do something. I mean, because people don't believe there is an opportunity because there is no an objective opportunity for that. And that's a sort of like a mental trap people fell into. Like, another quotation is also very, I mean, I think it's very interesting because also a woman, she says that, I don't know, I don't have any opinion about the war, and I cannot go to barricades, and I cannot find for anything because I just don't know what is good and what is bad. So I just completely lost. And in this case, my only option is just to stay aside, just not to be involved, not to be mentally involved, not to be emotionally involved in what's going on. Because, I mean, because that's just useless. I cannot do anything. And I think that it is very important to understand this thing, because that impacts very much on what we believe of how we believe people support or not support the war, because there are a lot of people we cannot even say sometimes if they support or not support the war, because they just feel that they are not empowered enough to have their own opinion about that, and they don't feel that it is even important to have an opinion about that, right? And this is the last thing I want to talk about. That's like the question of propaganda. And there was a lot of discussions about the impact of propaganda in this war. And there was a lot of people and experts who said, like, well, people in Russia are brainwashed, so that's why they support the war. But that's not that easy, I would say. So first, there are really, I mean, that's true. A lot of supporters, I mean, the more you watch TV, the more you support the war. That's true. But not all the supporters watch TV and state media, especially the young one. And some of them believe that propaganda is everywhere, and they're saying that too, but they still support the war. I mean, they can read different media, but I mean, they can read Medusa or Dost or whatever, and they still support the war. They have access to the information, but they support the war. So that's not about the lack of information why some people support the war. There are people who report they don't have any opinion about what's going on, but they also say that this is because of propaganda. I mean, what I want to say here is that propaganda become a sort of justification by itself, the information war. People say, yeah, that's information war everywhere. Everything is propaganda. That's why I don't believe that a lot of civilians were killed, but this war is a good thing. And people also say, yeah, propaganda is everywhere. That's why I just don't have any opinion about what's going on. So propaganda is an argument by itself. People just refer to this fact that everybody lies. Propaganda is everywhere to support any position they have, right? And I think that it is very important to understand, and for now I don't understand it myself, how much previous political views and social positions can predict attitudes toward the war. Because, for example, with my friends and my relatives, like everybody whom I know in Russia, I would say I was not surprised with their attitudes toward the war. So I believe that propaganda is very important here, but like pre-existent views, and not like I love Putin, I don't like Putin, I'm not interested in politics, but they should be analyzed in some other way, right? That's just, yeah, they can predict the attitudes toward the war. And we also should have it in mind when we think about how people support or not support the war. So how much depoliticization and like this apolitical culture impacts the attitude toward the war. We should ask ourselves, so if for many years people believe that they have no ability to influence what Putin does, what Russian authorities does, so how this situation impacts the way they treat this, the way they think about this war. And I'm coming to the conclusion. And I guess the most interesting question now is if it is possible that Russians change their opinions about the war, right? And what will happen then? And I would say, like, yes, it is possible. It is possible that the Russians will change their opinion about the war, but we don't know what this change will be. So what directions, so how they will change this opinion. And I would say that we can just see two very different paths here. So why the opinion of Russians about the war can be changed? So first, as I tried to demonstrate before, the support for the war is compound. I mean, it's complicated. There are just a number of people who support it because it's Nazis in Ukraine, Russia is right, and the West want to destroy Russia, right? For other people, they don't want people to be killed, they don't want Ukrainians to be killed or cities to be destroyed, but they still find some justifications for the war, right? And a lot of people still, they just don't understand. After 7 weeks of the war, they still don't understand what's the point, why Russia is doing that. They just don't understand that. And the second thing which can change people's opinion about the war is sanctions. Because probably not now, but within several months or 6 months, we will see the situation, economic situation in Russia will be changed a lot. And that will, that will make its impact. And also, the Russian achievements on the battlefield is also an important thing. But that's not necessarily that public opinion will be changed toward, people can, those people who more or less supported the war, they like in 6 months or like in 2 months, they will see how horrible everything is in Russia. They will still have no answer to this question, why we have this war at all, why Russia started this war at all. And they can say like, yeah, that was just stupid. Why they did that? Why Putin did that? And in that case, we can expect probably that all that rage and all that dissatisfaction, it will be aimed at Putin because he's the one who is responsible for that. And in the eyes of people, he's the guy who is doing that, right? But there is another scenario here. And the sanctions will hit Russia and Russia will be more isolated, but we will have this effect of like subaltern empire stuff, right? And people will say like, yeah, everybody hates us. The West hates us. The West wants to destroy us. We see it now very clearly that, yeah, maybe before it was not that obvious, but now we see the West is against us. Nobody loves Russians anymore. Ukrainians hate Russians. Like, there are a lot of sanctions. Yeah, we should be by ourselves and just no friendship with anybody. And Putin was right. Actually, initially Putin was right. We didn't get it, but yes, the West never wished us well. So yeah, I guess we can only continue observing here and not, yeah, I don't know, to hope for the better, I would say.
Great, thank you for that that presentation with just, I think, very valuable information and information we just don't have access to. So it's a really insider job. So thank you very much. As for everyone listening, we will get to the question and answer now. So if you want to type in your questions into the Q&A box, that would be great. And we'll start getting into those. I'll open with a question each for each of our participants. So the first question is for Yuliya. What surprised, I think, everyone was just the fighting spirit of Ukrainians as soon as the invasion started. And I, like many other people, just thought it was going to be over quickly. I mean, there were all these images of people getting Molotov cocktails and like they're going to defend their homes, which certainly happened. But in fact, Ukrainian military grew significantly from 2014 to the present, and they're in fact, just in terms of numbers, is bigger than the force that amassed on the borders of over 200,000. And then also the West really did support through arms and through training to a certain extent. So I'm just wondering if there's if Ukraine demonstrated its desire to be independent, if there's a correlation between that and the fighting spirit that emerged, and also the Western support that that emerged from 2014. In some ways, I want to say that we see a true democratic spirit. Is that because of a shift in values, or is that because of Western support, or is it just Zelensky being the hero?
There are multiple factors. Thank you so much for the question. It's a loaded question, and there are several approaches here. First of all, what happened in Ukraine, and it was the continuous process starting with the early 90s. It's something that was there in Russia early on in the revision of Soviet history, right? And de-Sovietization of especially Stalinism, especially what happened at that time. In Ukraine, it was combined, not only de-Sovietization was also combined with the process of decolonization, post-colonial discussions, right? And trying to break from that dealing with trauma, with historic trauma, with really brutal experiences that Ukrainians were subjected during the 20th century. We can talk about prosecutions during the Russian Empire and ban on language, ban on culture, ban on publications, but we have civil war in Ukraine, right, on the territory of Ukraine. We have collectivization and Stalin's Red Famine, Holodomor, again, ruthlessly executed and experienced by the people. My grandparents started sharing those experiences in the 90s, not before that. World War II, Holocaust, and prosecutions of intellectuals during the Great Purges, and then later during the 70s. and then Chernobyl. The way, and Ukrainians believe the way that Chernobyl was handled, the aftermath was to a great degree defined by the distance, that it was in the periphery, it was in Ukraine. If that happened somewhere around Moscow, Ukrainians were confident that things would have been handled differently. So those memories and those traumas were very vivid. Also, during the Maidan, there was this transformation of values, something that was not noticed because a lot of buzz was coming from Russia, but it was happening, and it was very empowering, and it was very, like, things shifted, and Ukrainians, who are internally, they're so diverse, ethnoculturally very diverse, with different views. When you start talking about history, everyone has different history. You can have a lot of clashing opinions. Yet what they experienced during the Euromaidan, especially, that unity in a shared vision for Ukraine's political future. And when you talk and listen to the reports right now, why are you here? We're fighting for our families. We're fighting for our future. We're fighting for the better opportunities to our children. And the last thing, it's the knowledge of the experience of those I mean, we can start with Chechnya and brutalities of Chechnya, and like Politkovskaya reported on the same mass rapings, gang rapings, burnings, and then Russian officers walking away without any prosecution or any consequences from those experiences. So it's not the first time, right? And Ukraine had access to that information. The same, the experiences of Ukrainians in Donbas, or ethnic Russian Ukrainians, or Russian speaking Ukrainians, right, in Donbas, in those breakaway regions, and the experiences from Izolatsiya, the most brutal concentration camp, and where torture, all kinds of torture inflicted on people. Recently, Stanislav Aseyev published his work in Ukraine and received the highest recognition, Shevchenko Prize, for that collection of essays. So Ukrainians were very much aware of what's coming, right? And we could see that, and we could see the results and reports. Even the Russian-speaking regions are very united, precisely because they saw what happened in Donbas. If you look into Kharkiv or Mariupol, the most destroyed cities, those are predominantly populated by ethnic Russian Ukrainians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and yet they suffer the most these days. So it's a combination of changed views, historical memory, but also utmost despair. Ukrainians know that they have no other way. That's the unity, and then the charisma of the president who stood there, who was there, and who was a very popular, loved character way before he was elected into the presidency.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and just to echo that, we started a course on contemporary Russia by looking at the bombings of apartment buildings within Russia to consolidate power. That's an unverified narrative, but it looks very suspiciously like Russian state power is willing to sacrifice civilians to consolidate power, which is just a tragic story. And the second question related to for Natalia's around just information, that you kind of claim that information that may not shift the opinions from the West, you know, especially in the US, where we have freedom of speech, that brings us into certain conflicts and party divisions, but we do have this thirst for information. And I'm just wondering if there was, if Russians did have access to the information of the atrocities, if their opinion would change. And this is a big historical question, because actually Russia hasn't been free since Stalin, really. There was only just a short period under Khrushchev with the thaw, where some information came out about atrocities under Stalin and related to the war. And then from basically 90 to 2000, okay, maybe some archives are open, there's information, access to it, but it's really not that long of a period. And then we start seeing clamping down information. So I just wonder if if it's maybe about a culture of information, about fact-finding, of seeking it, and of trusting the press that is at stake, not just like, oh, did you see this one particular atrocity? How is it going to change your opinion? So maybe you can speak about Russians' relationship to the media that they view, and why that puts them into conflict over seeing something, say, through their Telegram channel that says, there's a war atrocity, genocide in Bucha, and they don't believe it.
Yeah, that's very much about trust to the information. So as I said, there are different categories of people. So let's say like all the population who has access to information through TV, who just don't use, I don't know, 70 years old or like people, right? Many of them watch TV. So they don't have an access because it's not on TV and they're not like interested enough or whatever. I mean, they just get used to do it this way. Not all the population, but like most of them. But there are also younger people who have, so there are difficulties with access to information now. So for example, if you look for information through Yandex, you will have very different results than if you look through information through Google, right? And I think that that's important because I don't know if you at some point want to like, you're just, yeah, Bucha, what is that? And you just try to find some information in Yandex about that, well, probably you will not find that much because, yeah. So that's the problem too, but still people have this access, people still through VPN, people reading whatever, Medusa, Echa, they have access. So many people whom we interview, that, for example, following both more oppositionist channels and more pro-state channels, Ukrainian channels and Russian channels. So they have access to this different information, but they just somehow, and this also there is something mysterious in that, right? So they say, yeah, I just cannot decide what is true. I cannot just get to my own opinion about that because those people say this, those people say that. What is going on? For me, that's, I mean, when I was reading those interviews, I started doubting like my own possibility to judge, just, oh my God, how I can have opinion if it is that difficult, right? But yeah, there is something in that. There is denial for sure, especially for those people who support the war. They don't want to believe because this is one of their like justifying thing for all that. Russia doesn't kill civilians. Russia just only destroy military objects. I mean, still some people believe in that, and they just don't want to believe in that. That's just pure denial. But there are some other people who are like, yeah, we're confused. We don't understand. Like whatever. There is those people say. I mean, yeah, there's too much information. So yeah, it's just lack of trust. That's also, I think that also behind that, there is this idea that like, yeah, why would I bother? Why would I bother? I cannot. It's just nothing depends on me. Why would I bother? Who cares what kind of opinion I have about that? I will be only upset. Like if Russia really does that, how I will continue my life with that? Like, because I mean, you cannot see all that and just say, yeah, you know what? Okay, you have to like make something to do something, right?
Yeah, that's one effect of disinformation is not to necessarily to create conflict, but to fan the flames and also to sow doubt, most importantly. And that's, I feel like, just having just years and decades of doubt in the media really makes it so that there's more of a vacuum in terms of information and trust in Russia than we experience. Okay, great. So one question, this is potentially, opinions on the future, but considering it's from Imad, considering that the Russian armies step back from around Kiev, do you think that the war may end soon? Hopefully, and if yes, would that would that change the? Would there be an effect on the Russian state, on how the government of Russia?
That's the question for both of us.
Yeah, I think either of you can take it. Maybe you.
Sure, I'll start. Well. We should not be naive and expect a swift resolution of the conflict. At this point, the Kremlin and the regime is all in, considering the degree of atrocities already committed, and we should, and all the intelligence that is coming from the West, but also Ukraine. Everyone is gearing up for a big battle for the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine. And that will really define how what will happen next. But that's why right now it's very critical for Ukraine to receive the support, to put more pressure. The Ukraine in each official appeal to European powers, to the Western powers, Ukraine appeals for more support, more sanctions, and without closed skies, no matter how modernized or equipped a Ukrainian army is, they're still a smaller force than the Russian army. If Russia reorganizes and redesigns the plan, original victories were to a great degree due to Russia's miscalculations. Now Russia has a better picture of what's at stake in Ukraine. But Ukraine and Ukrainians seem to be very, very committed, especially after this 6 weeks, to defy Russian aggression and stand the ground. So unless the West interferes and puts the end to the slaughter, we're in for quite a bloody and long-term confrontation that can go for a long time, because it's one thing to occupy territories, but it's another to control them. And Ukraine is the territory with so much history of partisan warfare, resistance. People are united enough, and at this point, angry enough to stand their grounds. I mean, you have reports from media coming from all stratas of Ukrainian society participating and contributing to the cause. So the only hope for quick resolution is firm deference from the West, with closing skies, with, if not boots on the ground, really harsh measures, economic measures and pressures on Russian state, and full-blown support for Ukrainian troops on the ground.
Yeah, I also don't see how this war can be ended soon. I mean, I guess that many people believe that there will be just 1 week war or something like that at the beginning, and that Ukraine will fall. But everybody was like amazed how Ukraine fought. But yeah, I think so. If we talk about peace talks, that goes nowhere. I mean, as far as we can see, because Russian position and Ukrainian position, they just have nothing in common. There's just no common ground there, because Ukraine doesn't want to give up on its lands and territories, and Russia, that's what Russia wants. Russia wants to get some of Ukrainian territories and preserve them, and also to influence Ukrainian politics. So no way they can come to any resolution. And Putin invested too much for now in this war, and he promised too much. I mean, all that like denazification stuff, and the West who wants to destroy Russia, he cannot just step back and say like, whatever, yeah, let's go, yeah, that's okay, just let's stop that, whatever. So he cannot just step back without reaching some goals, and Ukrainian cannot stop fighting, because everything, the future of Ukraine depends on that. And the only way that I think that Ukraine, there is a way to end this war if the West will intervene really, or if the West stop supporting Ukraine. In this case, there will be just not that long, but I hope that first thing happens, or at least the West will continue support Ukrainian forces. But still, there is, I don't see how it will end soon. It's just, and that's very, very bad, because just more people are dying. And
yeah, not good news. Not good news. Melissa has her hand raised. You're welcome to ask your question. Can you? Are you muted?
I don't have a question. Sorry.
Go ahead. Did you have a comment? Oh, maybe there's Miss Q. Okay. All right. Now I'm raising my hand. Okay. All right. Yeah. So we'll wrap up. I do want to say that I've been reading Susan Sontag's really wonderful regarding the pain of others, which is about looking at photographs of war and what we can do in response. And one of her suggestions is that the initial response of sympathy just isn't enough. We always have to look for connections of our own involvement. And I think the West is very involved in this war, whether it be from a perspective of economic globalization that's causing problems, or its directing role in NATO, and NATO expansion that has put Ukraine in the sights of Russia, and also, of course, the deteriorating relationship that we've had with Russia over the past 20 years, and of course, we want to say that Russia is responsible for that, but we must take our responsibilities as well. So thank you, Yuliya and Natalia, for nuancing things for us significantly. Absolutely wonderful presentations. It's very rich with information and an investment. And we thank you so much. And thank you, Steve, for organizing, and for everyone for tuning in. And this will be up on I think YouTube shortly. So if you want to review it, you will be able to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Go Ukraine.